10 upstanding men gathered in my living room every Saturday. That was the beginning of my nightmare. It sounds almost polite, doesn't it? Upstanding men. Men with polished shoes. Men whose names carried weight in Lancaster. Men who would shake your hand on Sunday morning at St. Benedict's and call you neighbor or young lady with a smile. My father called them friends. I called them monsters. When my mother left with my siblings each weekend, my father would announce it as if it were some kind of family holiday. Entertainment hour, he said with a grin that never reached his eyes. I was 11. I didn't understand the words, not really. I just knew that once the door shut behind my mother and the others, the house changed shape. The walls grew taller, the air heavier. My name is Martha Johnson. I'm 71 now. I live in Bakersfield, California, in a small house with peeling paint and a wild lemon tree in the yard. It's a quiet street. Kids ride their bikes past my porch in the afternoons. A dog barks 2 houses down at the mailman. The world goes on. Most mornings I drink my coffee with carnation milk, the way a neighbor taught me when I first moved here. After breakfast, I step into my photography corner in the back room. My little studio, lined with cameras of every age and shape. Photography is how I survived. Through lenses, I learned to see beauty where I once saw only pain. My old Rolleiflex from the 60s sits on the highest shelf. It's the camera I rebuilt with my own hands. It's more than a machine to me. It's proof that broken things can work again. Proof that so can people. When I hold a camera now, I remember a different girl, a girl in a blue house with white windows in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A girl who stood barefoot on red clay soil, hair pulled back tight, hands trembling. A girl who thought humiliation was normal, who thought obedience would keep her safe. I was that girl. I teach photography now on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Teenagers from the neighborhood come to my backyard. We drink chamomile tea, practice with my old cameras. They talk about angles and filters, but sometimes they talk about their lives too. I listen. I always listen. Every click of the shutter feels like giving away a little piece of myself that no longer has to hide. But before I became a teacher, before I became a grandmother with a YouTube channel called Grandparents' Tales, before I learned that justice can come from places you don't expect, there was the house on Pine Hill Road. There was the smell of mildew and whiskey in ashtrays. There was my father's voice, low and commanding. Come here, Sarah. Sarah. Not Martha. They gave me another name, as if stripping me of my own. From the outside, our life looked perfect. Lancaster in the 1950s was a postcard town. Church bells on Sunday, farmers markets on Saturday. My mother baked bread twice a week. My father owned the hardware store everyone trusted. We were the Johnsons, the respectable family on the dirt road with the light blue house and the wooden bench where my grandfather smoked his pipe. During the day there was noise and running and laughter. I took care of my younger siblings. I walked to school with Everett, my brother. I climbed trees, picked cherries, came back with my feet stained red from clay and my mother scolding me with a laugh. Evenings were quieter. When my father came home we spoke softly, sat straight at the table. Respect, my mother called it. Fear, I know now. On Sundays after Mass, my father's friends began arriving. Men from every corner of town. The pharmacy owner, the bank manager, the lawyer, the commissioner, the sheriff. Men with smiles and slacks, carrying the smell of cologne and power. My mother would gather my siblings and leave. She needs to learn to be a good hostess, my father would say, his hand heavy on my shoulder. The first Sunday, June 1965, is burned into my memory. The poker table was set in the living room, green cloth, fresh decks of cards, a large ashtray at the center. My father introduced me as the hostess and told me to serve coffee. I kept my head down as he'd taught me. A well-educated girl doesn't look men in the eye, he always said. Sarah is becoming quite the young lady, Mr. Benedict said, calling me by the wrong name, as if I were a character in a play they'd written. I stood still, coffee pot in hand, heart hammering. My father smiled in a way I'd never seen before. We're lucky to have such a flower in our house, he said. That was the moment it all began. First it was small. Orders. Commands disguised as games. Stand on 1 foot and count to 30. Hop like a frog to the wall and back. Serve whiskey instead of coffee. Each time they laughed, glasses clinking, chips clattering. I obeyed. What else could I do? My father's eyes were on me like a blade. Then came the slipper. "You know disobedient girls need to be corrected," my father said, holding the worn leather as if it were a tool, not a weapon. 5 slaps, 1 from each man. Not hard enough to bruise but hard enough to humiliate. Tears burned my eyes. "Father, I didn't disobey," I whispered. "That doesn't matter," he said. The final touch was the bed. Mr. Oswald carried a steaming kettle into my room. "Hot water for the little princess's bed," he joked as they poured it across my mattress, soaking it through. My father's voice followed, calm, almost gentle. "So you'll remember this lesson every time you go to sleep." When they left, I curled on the floor beside the wet mattress, too tired to cry. When my mother returned, he told her I'd spilled the water. She nodded, believed it or pretended to. I didn't know which was worse. The next Sunday it happened again. And the next. And the next. I began to live as 2 people. Martha, who went to school, washed dishes, helped with the garden. And Sarah, the name they gave me, the girl who stood trembling in the living room while upstanding men laughed. For years I thought this was normal. That every home had its secret games. That humiliation was education. That obedience was safety. I know now that it wasn't. I know now that small lenses have big eyes. And that sometimes technology becomes the weapon no one expects. But back then at 11 I was just a girl on the floor beside a soaked mattress, staring at the ceiling, whispering a promise to myself. Someday I will leave. Someday I will show them. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. I only knew I had to survive long enough to find a way. And that's where my story begins. I lived 2 lives. That was the only way to survive. During the week I was Martha. I walked to school with Everett, carried Cynthia on my hip when Mama was too tired, peeled potatoes in the kitchen, fed the chickens. My teachers called me quiet, well-mannered, polite. At church, neighbors said, "That Johnson girl, she's a fine example." I nodded, smiled, kept my secrets locked behind my teeth. But on Sundays, when the cars lined up on Pine Hill Road, when the men came with their polished shoes and their too sweet cologne, I became Sarah. Sarah wasn't allowed to laugh. Sarah wasn't allowed to look anyone in the eye. Sarah existed to obey. It went on for years. At first, it was humiliations disguised as lessons. Stand like a statue for hours. Recite verses until my voice cracked. Pour whiskey for men who never ran out of thirst. Each mistake, each hesitation was another reason to punish me. If I moved, they threw cold water on me. If I stumbled on a math problem, they made me repeat. I am nothing. I am worthless. I am shame. Over and over until I believed it. Then came the games. They called one of them school. Mr. Clovis, the lawyer, loved it most. He'd bring questions he knew I couldn't answer. History, literature, equations far beyond my years. When I got it wrong, I had to write sentences until my hand cramped. Not on paper. On my skin with chalk. My arms, my legs, my bare back. Covered in chalky white lines that washed off with water but stayed burned in my memory. Another game was the statue. I had to stand in the center of the living room like a piece of furniture. Hours. If I swayed, they laughed. If I scratched my nose, I was splashed with icy water to keep me still. My legs trembled until I thought they'd snap in half. My father always watched. He never smiled, not fully. But there was pride in his eyes, a cruel satisfaction that made my stomach twist. "She's learning," he'd say, as if teaching obedience were a noble thing. By the time I turned 14, I barely remembered what freedom felt like. I no longer joined games in the backyard with Josephine or Lucy. I didn't go to birthday parties. I sat at the window instead, watching other children laugh, convinced they could see my shame written across my face. Mama noticed I had changed. Of course she did. Once she asked me softly, "Martha, is everything all right when I'm gone?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her everything. But fear sealed my throat. "I just get tired," I said. She looked at me with sad eyes, eyes that already knew. She never asked again. I started having nightmares. I'd wake in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, biting my pillow so my screams wouldn't wake Cynthia. Sometimes I dreamed I was locked in the green-walled living room forever. Sometimes I dreamed the men's voices turned into a roar and swallowed me whole. By 17 I was 2 people completely. Martha at school, Sarah at home on Sundays. And slowly Martha was fading. I thought of running. I saved coins from sewing jobs, A little stash hidden in a tin box under my mattress. Maybe one day I could buy a bus ticket to Philadelphia. But where would I go? Who would take me in? The unknown terrified me almost as much as the life I already knew. And then one weekday afternoon, hope walked right into my life in the form of a help wanted sign. I was coming back from school, books pressed tight against my chest, when I saw it in the window of an electronics store downtown. Part-time help wanted. Ask for Mr. Milton. My feet froze. I read the sign 3 times, heart hammering. A job. My own money. A reason to leave the house without questions. I didn't even let myself think. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mr. Milton was in his 60s, hair white as chalk, glasses thick as a bottle bottom. He looked me up and down, then asked, "Are you responsible?" "Yes, sir." "Can you count money?" "Yes, sir." "Can you show up on time?" "Yes, sir." And just like that, I was hired. "You seem serious and reliable," he said. If only he knew the irony. The first time I stepped behind the counter, I felt air in my lungs I hadn't felt in years. Radios lined the shelves. Record players hummed softly when tested. And in one corner, shining beneath glass, were cameras. I was fascinated. First, I was clumsy. My hands shook as I loaded film. My first photo came out blurred, dark, useless. I nearly cried. But then I told myself, "Martha, you face worse things than a bad picture." And I tried again. Mr. Milton noticed. He saw the way I hovered by the cameras, my fingers itching. "Do you want to learn?" he asked one evening as he wiped dust from a Polaroid. "Yes, please." He smiled. "Then pay attention." So I learned. I learned about aperture and shutter speed, about lenses and light. I learned how to develop film, how to watch an image slowly emerge on paper in the red glow of the darkroom. It was like magic, like watching truth appear out of nothing. Photography became my escape. While the men laughed in my living room on Sundays, I thought of angles and exposure, of how light bends around a subject. At night, when nightmares tried to swallow me, I imagined myself behind a camera, seeing the world through glass instead of through fear. And then came the day that changed everything. It was 1971. I just turned 17. Cameras were evolving, smaller, more discreet. Mr. Milton showed me a new model one afternoon, a compact surveillance camera barely larger than a fist. "Businesses are starting to use these," he said, "to catch thieves or monitor employees." My breath caught. I stared at that tiny lens, that quiet, unblinking eye, because suddenly, for the first time in years, I saw a weapon. Not of violence, not of fists or slaps, but of truth. The men thought they owned my silence. They thought their titles and polished shoes protected them. They thought no one would ever know. But small lenses have big eyes. That night, lying on my bed with my stash of coins hidden beneath me, I whispered to myself, "This is it. This is how I survive. This is how I fight back." I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But the seed was planted. The girl who had been broken, humiliated, erased, was starting to rise. And I promised myself, one day they would see themselves the way I saw them, through the unblinking eye of a camera. I still remember the first night I smuggled the little camera home. My hands shook the entire walk. I had tucked it inside my school bag, wrapped in brown paper, praying no one would stop me, no one would ask questions. When I opened the front door, my father was in the kitchen, boots caked with mud, muttering about the store. He glanced at me, at the bag in my arms, and then looked away. My heart nearly exploded in relief. I went straight to my room and locked the door. Cynthia was staying at a friend's house, and Mama was busy with supper. I tore the paper off like it was a Christmas gift, and there it was, the tiny lens, the weapon I dreamed about. For a moment, I just held it in my palm, whispering to myself, "This is the beginning." The fear was real. What if they discovered it? What if my father found the camera before I even had the chance to use it? But fear was no longer enough to paralyze me. It had to be my fuel. I studied every instruction booklet Mr. Milton had given me. I learned where to place the film, how to keep the shutter quiet, how to angle the lens so it looked like part of the furniture. Every night, I practiced setting it up in different corners of my room. Each click of the shutter made my pulse race, but it also made me stronger. And then came Sunday. The cars arrived as always. Dust rose on Pine Hill Road. Men's voices filled the living room. I could smell whiskey before I even stepped inside. My stomach twisted. I felt Sarah creeping over me like a shadow. But this time Sarah wasn't empty. Sarah had a secret. I'd hidden the camera behind a stack of old books on the living room shelf, angled just right to see the poker table, the green cloth, the ashtray in the center. Its tiny eye blinked open as the men settled in. None of them noticed. Not even my father. When he called me into the room, "Sarah, bring the glasses," I obeyed as usual. My voice trembled, but my hands didn't. The camera was watching. For the first time in 6 years, someone else was watching. The night went on. Orders barked. Laughter sharp as knives. "Sarah, hop like a rabbit." "Sarah, stand in the corner." "Sarah, pour another drink." Each humiliation tore at me, but I held on. I kept reminding myself, this is evidence. This is proof. One day these walls will speak. When it was over, when the last car rolled away into the night, I crept into the living room, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell. I retrieved the camera, pressed it to my chest like it was a heartbeat. That week, after work, I stayed in the back of Mr. Milton's shop, developing the film in the red glow of the darkroom. My hands trembled as the first image appeared on the paper. The circle of men, cards in hand, and me, standing in the middle, head down like a broken doll. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to tear the photo in half. But I didn't. I let it dry. I stared at it until my tears blurred the edges. It was proof. It was real. For months I kept filming. Not every Sunday, I couldn't risk suspicion, but often enough. Every roll of film I smuggled into the shop felt like carrying a piece of dynamite in my pocket. And yet, each time the images appeared, men in their fine suits laughing while I was humiliated, I felt a strange kind of power return to me. It was dangerous. If my father discovered the camera, he would kill me. I don't say that lightly. He would have snapped my neck before letting the town see what he'd hidden for so long. But as the photographs piled up, hidden in a shoebox beneath my bed, I began to dream. Dream of escape. Dream of justice. Dream of holding up those photographs in the middle of church and shouting, "Look! Look at your upstanding men." But reality was harsher. Who would believe me? Who would dare accuse the commissioner, the sheriff, the doctor, the bank manager? They had power. They had money. They had the entire town wrapped around their fingers. And I was just a girl with trembling hands and a box of photographs. Still, I couldn't stop. Every photo was a piece of my soul clawing its way back. At 18, I finally graduated high school. There was no party, no celebration. My father didn't even attend. He said he had business at the store. I stood there in my cap and gown, Mama at my side, Cynthia and Thomas cheering, and felt hollow. But tucked inside my bag, wrapped in paper, was another roll of film. That night, alone in my room, I whispered to myself, someday these photos will speak louder than I ever could. And then one Saturday in late summer, everything shifted. Started like any other. The men arrived. Whiskey poured. My father barked orders. But this time they were restless, angrier, drunker. Mr. Benedict slammed his fist on the table when he lost a hand of cards. The sheriff shouted at me to smile, damn it, smile. My body ached, but my mind was steady. The camera was rolling. Until suddenly, my father's eyes landed on the shelf. He frowned. Walked toward it. My heart froze. "Why are these books stacked like this?" he asked, pulling one forward. The world tilted. I couldn't breathe. If he moved them an inch more, he'd see it. The camera. The proof. My weapon. I stood there trembling, my voice breaking. I was dusting. I must have put them back wrong. His eyes drilled into mine. Seconds stretched like hours. The room went silent. Even the sheriff stopped laughing. Finally, my father grunted. "Fix it." He turned back to the table. My knees nearly gave out. That night, when the men finally left, I retrieved the camera with shaking hands. My secret was safe for now, but I knew it wouldn't be forever. The shoebox under my bed was growing heavier. The film, the photos, the truth, they were waiting. And I realized something terrifying. Hiding them wasn't enough anymore. It was time to decide. Would I keep surviving in silence? Or would I risk everything, my safety, my life, to finally make the truth known? I stared at the shoebox, heart pounding, and whispered into the darkness. It's almost time. The shoebox under my bed had become a living thing. At night, when the house was silent and the only sound was the creak of the old beams, I swore I could hear it breathing. The photos whispered to me, rustling like dry leaves. They demanded, do something. Speak. Show the world. But fear gripped me like chains. Every day I carried the weight of that box in my chest. At the store, while helping Mr. Milton organize radios or sell a toaster, my thoughts would drift back to the photographs. I imagined them in a courtroom, in a newspaper, pinned on bulletin boards across Lancaster, the truth screaming where my voice could not. And then I imagined my father's face, his fury, the sheriff's revolver, the commissioner's influence, the banker's money. What could I, an 18-year-old girl, possibly do against men like them? Yet I couldn't ignore the feeling that the tide was shifting inside me. One afternoon, as I was dusting shelves at the shop, Mr. Milton noticed my distraction. "You've been quiet lately, Martha," he said gently. His glasses slid down his nose, and he pushed them back up with a smile. "You look like someone carrying secrets too heavy for her shoulders." I froze. Did he know? I guess I just think too much," I muttered. He chuckled softly. "Thinking isn't the enemy. Silence is." Then he returned to his work, leaving me trembling. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Silence is the enemy. His words looped in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. Maybe he was right. Maybe silence had been killing me all along. The next Sunday session felt different. I was no longer just surviving. I was watching them with a new eye, measuring their power, their arrogance. Every time one of them laughed at my humiliation, I thought, "You have no idea your faces are captured. One day you'll see yourselves through my lens." It gave me strength. I stood taller even while obeying. The fear was still there, but it was no longer everything. But then something happened that nearly broke me. It was late October. Cold wind rattled the windows as the men gathered. This time, the sheriff was drunker than usual. His voice was loud, slurred. At some point, he slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "She's not a child anymore, Alfred. She's a woman. When do we get more than games?" My blood ran cold. The room went quiet. All eyes turned to my father. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. "Calculating. Measuring. Patience," he said finally. "Her time will come." I nearly collapsed where I stood. My legs felt like water. My chest burned. They weren't done breaking me, they were planning worse. Much worse. That night, when the last car rolled away, I didn't even wait. I dragged the shoebox from beneath my bed and sat cross-legged on the floor, tears streaming down my face. I laid the photos out like cards in a terrible game. Faces, hands, whiskey glasses, me standing small in the center. If I didn't act soon, there would be nothing left of me. The question was, who could I trust? The police were useless. The sheriff himself was one of them. The commissioner, the lawyer, the banker, all powerful men. If I went to the authorities, I would be crushed. But then I remembered Mrs. Green. She had been my English teacher, the only adult who had ever looked at me with eyes full of suspicion, concern. She had once asked if I was safe at home, and though I had lied, the memory of her voice still lingered. The next week at school, I approached her classroom after hours. My hand shook as I clutched my bag. She was grading papers, her reading glasses low on her nose. "Martha," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here so late?" I closed the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might knock the breath out of me. "Mrs. Green," I whispered, "I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to tell anyone yet." Her eyes sharpened immediately. "Go on." My throat closed. The words stuck like thorns. For a long time I just stood there trembling while she watched me with patient silence. And then with shaking hands I opened my bag, pulled out the envelope of photographs, and slid them across her desk. She frowned, then lifted the first photo. Her eyes widened. She lifted another. Then another. Her face drained of color. "Oh dear God," she whispered. I broke then. I sobbed so violently my knees gave way, and she rushed around the desk to hold me. For the first time in years I let someone hold me while I cried. When I finally quieted, she spoke, her voice firm. "Martha, this is monstrous. But these photographs, this is evidence. This could destroy them." "I'm scared," I whispered. "If they find out." She pulled back to look at me, her hands on my shoulders. Listen to me. You are not alone anymore. I will help you. We'll find the right way to do this. For the first time, I felt something like hope. But hope is a fragile thing. The following Sunday, something strange happened. My father was colder, more watchful. He barely spoke, only sipped his whiskey and stared at me with narrowed eyes. I could feel suspicion rolling off him like heat from a stove. And then, as the men laughed and played cards, he leaned forward and said, "Sarah, come here." I stepped closer, my stomach in knots. He studied me, his eyes sharp as knives. "You've been different lately. Not so broken. Not so quiet. What's changed?" The room went silent. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Nothing," I whispered. His eyes narrowed further. Then slowly he smiled. A smile that chilled me to the bone. "We'll see," he said. That night I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my mind. "We'll see." Somehow he knew. Or at least he suspected. And then came the knock at my bedroom door. Heavy. Demanding. "Martha," his voice growled. "Open up." My blood turned to ice. The shoebox was still under my bed. The photographs. The proof. If he came in, if he saw, everything would be over. I pressed my back against the door, heart racing while his fist pounded again. "Martha," he said, lower this time, almost a hiss. "I know you're hiding something." I held the door shut with all my weight, my palms slick with sweat. My father's voice was calm now, almost coaxing, and that was worse than his anger. "Martha," he whispered, "I've always known when you're lying. Don't make me prove it tonight." I could barely breathe. The shoebox under my bed seemed to glow like a lantern in the dark, daring him to find it. "Go to bed, Daddy," I managed, my voice cracking. "Please. I'm tired." For a moment, silence. Then his fist struck the door once, sharp and final like a judge's gavel. "We'll see," he said again, and his footsteps retreated down the hall. I didn't move for a long time. I sat there on the floor, back against the wood, shaking so hard I thought my bones would rattle. I kept staring at the shadows beneath the bed, half expecting his hand to reach through the door and drag the shoebox out. By dawn I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep the photographs in the house any longer. If he found them, if any of the men even suspected, they'd destroy me before I had the chance to destroy them. That morning before school, I slipped the envelope of photos into my school bag and walked with steady steps to Mrs. Green's classroom. She was already there, sipping tea at her desk. When I handed her the envelope, my voice was steady for once. "Keep them, please. If something happens to me, don't let them disappear." Her eyes widened, but she nodded. "I'll keep them safe, Martha. I promise." For the first time in years, I felt a little lighter walking into the day. But safety was a fragile illusion. 2 weeks later, I came home from school to find my father waiting in the kitchen. His sleeves rolled up, his hands resting on the table, too still. My stomach flipped. "Your teacher came by today," he said slowly. My heart stopped. She was asking questions. About our family. About you. Said you seemed troubled. He leaned forward. "Why would she say that, Martha?" My mouth went dry. I don't know. Maybe she worries too much." His eyes drilled into me. He stood towering, and for a second I thought he'd strike me. But instead he just smiled. That awful, dangerous smile. "You're a clever girl," he said. "But don't forget, every clever girl eventually makes a mistake." Then he walked out, leaving me trembling. That night I couldn't stop thinking. He was circling me like a predator, testing weak spots in the cage. Mrs. Green had to be careful, or she'd draw suspicion too fast. The following Sunday the men returned. But this time something felt different in the air. My father was sharper, harsher with me. He ordered me to recite humiliating phrases, louder than ever before. When I faltered, the sheriff barked, "She's hiding something!" And the room broke into ugly laughter. But I wasn't broken. Not anymore. Because while they sneered, I pictured their faces frozen in the photos. I imagined the gasps if the town saw. I imagined their wives, their children, their precious reputations burning down to ash. And inside me something hardened. The game had shifted. That week, Mrs. Green pulled me aside after class. She whispered, "Martha, I showed the photos to a friend I trust. He's a journalist in Philadelphia. He thinks this story could." Her voice faltered. She looked around, lowering it further. It could bring them all down. But he needs more. Clearer faces. Something undeniable. My blood turned to ice. More. Going back in with the camera now felt like walking into the lion's den with meat strapped to my chest. But if the evidence wasn't strong enough, the men would bury the story and me along with it. That Saturday night I didn't sleep. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching the little surveillance camera Mr. Milton had sold me at a discount. My heart thundered like a drum. When Sunday came, I tucked the device under my sweater. My hands shook so badly pouring whiskey into glasses I nearly spilled. And then it happened. The sheriff, drunk and careless, pulled me toward him. My father didn't stop him. Instead, he raised his glass and said, "To loyalty among men." The laughter that followed echoed in my skull, but my mind was elsewhere. I pressed the button hidden in my pocket. The tiny red light flicked on unseen. Click. One photo. Then another. Then another. Faces caught mid-laughter. Mouths twisted with cruelty. Eyes gleaming with filth. Every click was a prayer. Every image a weapon. When the evening ended, I hid the new film roll inside the lining of my shoe. That night, I walked to Mrs. Green's house in the dark, heart hammering. When she opened the door, I pressed the roll into her hand. "This is it," I whispered. "This will be enough." She hugged me tight. "You're so brave, Martha. So much braver than they'll ever be." But bravery is a dangerous thing. The next Sunday, my father was waiting for me in the living room before the men even arrived. He didn't call me Sarah. He didn't even smile. "Where were you last Sunday night?" he asked flatly. I froze. My breath caught. He leaned closer. "Don't lie." For a split second I thought of saying the truth. "I was at Mrs. Green's, handing her the proof that will ruin you." But instead I whispered, "I went for a walk." His eyes narrowed. "A walk." He stood, towering, his shadow swallowing mine. "You're hiding something, Martha. I can smell it on you." And then, with a voice low and dangerous, he said words that sent ice through my veins. "If you betray me, you won't live to regret it." The moment my father said those words, something inside me shifted. "If you betray me, you won't live to regret it." I stared at him, at the man who'd stolen my childhood, who'd turned me into Sarah on Sunday afternoons, who believed fear was stronger than truth. For the first time I didn't look away. I think he saw it, the flicker in my eyes that meant I was no longer afraid in the way he needed me to be. He sneered, muttered something under his breath and walked away. But I knew then. Time had run out. If I waited another week, if I hesitated, he would find the negatives. He would tear Mrs. Green apart with his reputation, and he would finish what he started with me. I had to act. The next morning, I slipped out of the house before dawn. My heart hammered as I walked across town, the shoebox under my arm wrapped in an old sweater. Mrs. Green answered the door in her nightgown, startled to see me so early. "It's all here," I said, thrusting the box into her hands. "Every roll, every picture. Keep it safe. If something happens to me, promise you'll show them to your journalist friend." Her face paled. "Martha, what are you saying?" I gripped her wrist. "Promise me." She swallowed hard. "I promise." For the rest of that week, I lived like a hunted animal. Every creak of the floorboards, every slam of a car door outside made me flinch. My father's eyes followed me more closely. His silence is heavier. Even my siblings noticed. Cynthia asked, "Why is Daddy so mad at you lately?" I couldn't answer. Then Sunday came. The men arrived as always, their cars gleaming on our dirt road, their laughter booming through the house before they even crossed the threshold. Whiskey bottles clinked. Cigarettes lit. The familiar stench of smoke and arrogance filled the air. But this time was different. Half an hour into their games, the doorbell rang. Sharp. Unexpected. Everyone froze. My father frowned, irritated, and motioned for me to answer. My legs shook as I walked to the door, every step heavy as stone. When I opened it, 2 men stood there. Not my father's friends. Not anyone from Lancaster I recognized. They wore plain suits, carried leather cases. One flashed a badge. "Good afternoon, miss. We're here to see Alfred Johnson." Behind me, chairs scraped. A hush fell over the room. My father appeared at my shoulder, towering, his jaw tight. "What's this about?" The taller man spoke calmly. We've received evidence of misconduct. We'd like to ask a few questions. I swear, for one glorious second I thought I might collapse from relief. The photographs had made it. Mrs. Green's friend had acted faster than I ever dreamed. But then chaos erupted. The sheriff lunged forward. This is ridiculous. A smear campaign. Others shouted, cursed. My father's hand clamped onto my arm like a vice. His nails dug deep. What did you do? He hissed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight with terror and triumph. The officers pressed into the living room. One pulled open the liquor cabinet. Another scanned the poker table, the scattered cards, the half-empty glasses. My father barked. You need a warrant. The taller officer replied smoothly. We have one. He held it up. The room went silent. One by one, the men's faces drained of color. They weren't invincible anymore. What followed was chaos. Papers rustling, handcuffs snapping, angry voices shouting over each other. I stood in the corner trembling, clutching my arm where my father had grabbed me. When they tried to drag the sheriff out, he snarled. You'll ruin this whole town, girl. Do you understand? Everything will collapse because of you. I almost laughed, because that was the point. My father was the last to be led away. He didn't fight, didn't shout. He just stared at me with those cold eyes that once made me cower. You think you've won, he said quietly, but you'll always be Sarah. For a moment I felt the old fear creep back, the shadow of years of Sundays pressing on me. But then I straightened my shoulders and met his gaze. No, I said. My name is Martha. The weeks after were a blur. Reporters swarmed Lancaster. Headlines screamed of corruption, secret rituals, and the fall of respected men. The community was split. Some refused to believe, others whispered they'd always suspected. Mrs. Green was fired from her job for improper conduct, but she didn't regret it. I'd do it all again, she told me with a tired smile. Her journalist friend printed the photos in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Faces frozen in cruelty, names attached. The world knew. As for my family, everything changed. My siblings were confused, frightened. My mother wept more than I'd ever seen. She avoided my eyes, as though my truth was too heavy for her to carry. Eventually, she took Cynthia and Thomas to live with relatives. Everett left for the army. The house emptied and I was alone. But alone was better than broken. I stayed in Lancaster long enough to finish school, then left for Philadelphia with nothing but a suitcase and the camera Mr. Milton had given me. Photography became more than a hobby, it was survival. Each click of the shutter reminded me that I could frame life on my own terms. Over time I built a new life. A job. A home. Friends who saw me as more than a secret. Slowly, painfully, I learned that the lies my father's men drilled into me were just that, lies. I wasn't worthless. I wasn't Sarah. I was Martha Johnson, survivor, witness, truth-teller. And one day, sitting in a quiet apartment with sunlight streaming across my Rolleiflex, I realized something. Justice hadn't come the way I expected. It wasn't neat. It didn't erase the scars. But it came. And when it did, it shattered the illusion that men like my father could rule forever. Now at 71, I tell this story not because it's easy, but because silence is what kept me chained for so long. 10 men thought they could break me piece by piece. They thought no one would ever see. But small lenses have big eyes. And every secret has its reckoning. So if you're listening to me now, somewhere out there, remember this. Even the darkest room can be lit with one flash. And when the picture finally develops, truth is undeniable.